They told everyone I chose distance. But how do you explain being uninvited from Thanksgiving by your own family just because your sister said so? I said nothing. I worked. I built. I waited. 10 years later, their Thanksgiving dinner was held at the top of Bryant Tower. My restaurant, my floor, my rules. The moment they saw me walking in, their smiles cracked like glass. I'm Clara Bennett, and this is how silence became my loudest answer. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was the week of Thanksgiving 2015, and the air in New Jersey already smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon. From my 5th-floor apartment, I could see the glow of restaurants across the street, full of people clinking glasses, laughing, rehearsing their gratitude. I had been wrapping a small box of chocolates for my mom when my phone buzzed. An email. Subject line this year. Mom's message was short, almost gentle. Sweetheart, maybe it's best if you take this Thanksgiving to rest. Victoria thinks you could use some space, and honestly, it might make the day less stressful for everyone. I read it 3 times, waiting for some other meaning to appear, but the words stayed the same. I called her right away. No answer. Tried again. Straight to voicemail. I told myself she must be busy in the kitchen, but deep down, I knew better. A few minutes later, a text popped up from my sister. Nothing personal. Clara, it's just, this year's going to be a little tight. You know how Dad gets. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Nothing personal. The phrase had a way of turning cruelty into courtesy. I put the phone down and looked at the picture on my wall. Thanksgiving 3 years ago. Me, Victoria, Mom, Dad, all smiling in front of the big turkey. I was the one who cooked that bird, spent 2 days basting and seasoning it, and Dad still said, "It's fine, honey, just not quite as refined as your sister's last year." Victoria had ordered hers from a catering service, but in this family presentation always beat effort. Now I was being given space. Outside, the sky was fading to navy blue streetlights coming on one by one. I made tea just to keep my hands busy, but my chest felt hollow. I kept hearing Mom's voice in my head, calm and diplomatic. It wasn't anger, it was dismissal, which somehow hurt worse. When the phone buzzed again, I thought for a second it might be her, maybe a change of heart. It wasn't. It was a group post on social media, my family all dressed in matching beige and gold, standing around the long mahogany table in the dining room. Candles everywhere. Victoria in the center holding a glass of wine. The caption read, "Grateful for this beautiful family." I didn't press like, I didn't comment. I just watched the screen until the photo dimmed. I tried to eat something, microwave pasta, but it tasted like paper. I turned on the TV, some Thanksgiving special with celebrities reading letters of gratitude. I muted it after 2 minutes. The silence felt truer. For a while, I walked circles around the apartment, touching things just to prove I was still here, the chipped mug Michael had given me back in college, the cheap lamp I'd assembled wrong, so it leaned a little to the left, the postcard from a restaurant in Manhattan, where I'd once dreamed of working. That postcard caught the light from the window. The skyline shimmered faintly through the glass, tall buildings piercing the dusk like needles of gold. Somewhere out there, people were raising toasts, promising they'd always have each other. Somewhere out there, my family was saying grace, probably thanking God for peace and harmony. I stepped onto the balcony, the cold air cutting across my face. The city hummed below. Traffic sirens, the occasional burst of laughter. I breathed it in. The loneliness didn't feel sharp anymore, just wide like the night itself. I thought of the years before, how I'd show up early to help Mom set the table, how Victoria would arrive half an hour late and still be the center of attention. How I'd wash dishes while everyone talked business and vacations. I'd never expected equality, but I thought at least there was a place for me at that table. Now even that place had been erased, replaced by polite silence and a text message. I went back inside, shut the balcony door, and turned off the lights. The apartment sank into darkness, except for the faint orange glow from the city. I stood there a long time watching the skyline flicker. For a second, I imagined them noticing my absence. Maybe Mom hesitated when she set out the plates. Maybe Dad mentioned my name once low enough for no one to hear. Maybe Victoria smiled and changed the subject. Maybe not. The wind pressed against the windows, steady, constant. I whispered into the quiet, "Not to anyone in particular. You can keep your table." I poured the cold tea into the sink, grabbed my coat, and stepped out into the hallway. The building smelled of turkey and pumpkin pie from other apartments. Someone's laughter echoed from the elevator. I walked down the stairs instead. Outside, the night had a metallic taste, crisp and alive. I crossed the street and stood by the railing overlooking the Hudson River. The reflections of the city shimmered on the water, endless and bright. I watched until the chill bit through my gloves, until my heartbeat slowed. In the distance beyond all that glass and light, I could almost see the world I wanted. One where I didn't need an invitation to belong. Maybe this was the first time I really understood it. People can shut you out of their table, but they can't make you stop hungering for what's fair. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of horns and laughter. I turned toward the city lights and started walking. The first Monday of January 2016 felt like the start of a life I hadn't chosen, but one I had to survive. The holiday decorations still hung in the lobby of the Logistics and Supplies office in Midtown Manhattan, tinsel drooping fake snow gathering dust. I walked in 15 minutes early the way I always did, clutching a paper cup of burnt coffee and pretending it tasted like something better. My job wasn't glamorous. I managed shipment records for a chain of restaurants scattered across the East Coast, tracking invoices, logging deliveries, confirming that what left the warehouse matched what reached each kitchen. Every day felt the same, the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of cardboard and fryer oil clinging to the air. I kept my head down and worked fast, maybe too fast. People noticed, but not kindly. You don't have to play superhero. Clara, one of my coworkers, joked one afternoon, rolling his eyes, as I double-checked a spreadsheet. "You're making the rest of us look bad." I smiled because that's what you do when you don't belong. You make yourself smaller. The only person who seemed to notice anything real about me was my manager, Michael Hayes. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, always, in rolled-up sleeves, with the calm kind of authority that came from failure and recovery. He'd catch me during coffee breaks and say things like, "You've got an eye for details." People like that either get promoted or get eaten alive. One gray February afternoon, I was restocking files in the storage room when I heard voices rising down the hall. Two senior managers, Paul and Janet, were arguing near the inventory logs. "You can't just move the numbers like that," Janet hissed. "It's not moving." Paul shot back. "It's aligning. Corporate expects us to hit margin. You want to explain to them why we overbought seafood last quarter." They didn't see me in the doorway. I stood frozen, holding a folder against my chest. The words hung in the air like smoke. Aligning. Not lying, just adjusting reality. That night when I left work, the city felt sharper colder. I rode the subway home with a copy of the Times abandoned on the seat next to me. The headline about a restaurant closing for health violations caught my eye. I thought of Paul's voice, calm and practiced. Aligning. Honesty didn't seem to matter much in this world. By March, the rhythm of the office had settled again. Deadlines, deliveries, memos. I learned to blend in, efficient, invisible. Still, Michael would occasionally stop by my desk. "How's the paperwork queen today?" he'd tease. I'd laugh politely. But one afternoon he lingered, leaning against the cubicle wall. "You ever think about running your own place someday?" I looked up from the computer. "Me? I barely keep this one running." He chuckled. "That's the point. You already do the hard part, making things work when no one's watching. Most people never learn that." Later that week, he invited me to lunch at a small diner 2 blocks from the office. Over pancakes and coffee, he told me about his past, how he'd once owned a restaurant in Queens with his brother, how they lost it after the financial crash in 2008. "I thought honesty would save us," he said quietly, stirring his coffee. It didn't. My brother fudged numbers to keep us afloat. When the IRS came calling, guess who got the blame? The honest one. He gave a small, tired smile. "Don't get me wrong, integrity's worth something. Just make sure you don't trade your sanity for it." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. But the story stayed with me. By April, I'd started reading every article I could find about the restaurant industry. How margins worked, why so many places failed, what made the survivors different. The patterns were always the same: ambition, greed, compromise. The stronger you held your principles, the easier it was for someone else to use them against you. Still, there was something intoxicating about it. The chaos, the rhythm, the idea that one good decision could change everything. One Friday, we stayed late, closing out inventory reports. The office was nearly empty. Michael looked up from his desk and said, "You've got that look again." "What look?" The look of someone realizing she's meant for more than this. I laughed, shaking my head. You sound like a self-help book, maybe. But I've been around long enough to spot a spark. Don't let them drown it out. When I left that night, snow had started to fall. I stood under the streetlight for a moment, letting it melt against my coat. The city hummed around me, indifferent, alive. At home, I microwaved leftover noodles, sat on the couch, and scrolled through my phone. That's when I saw her again, Victoria. My sister's face filled the screen, bright and perfect on the cover of a glossy magazine, New Jersey's Rising Star. The headline read, Victoria Bennett, the Young Attorney. Redefining Success. The article featured her smiling beside our parents, the three of them framed by soft lighting and good taste. The caption beneath the photo read, The Bennett Family, a portrait of unity and achievement. I froze, thumb hovering over the screen. A laugh escaped me, short and hollow. Unity and achievement. The words blurred. I could almost hear my father's voice again, praising Victoria for her confidence, my mother for her grace, as if I'd never been part of the picture. I closed the article and grabbed the small notebook on my table, the one where I wrote down grocery lists and half-formed thoughts. I flipped to a blank page and without thinking wrote goal for this year, learn everything about food and business. I stared at the sentence, then underlined it twice. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and silent, covering the streets like a clean slate. It felt like a promise I wasn't sure how to keep yet, but for the first time in months, it was mine. By 2018, I'd learned how to disappear in plain sight. At 27, I was the supply chain supervisor for an operations firm that handled contracts for half the major restaurants in New York, and by some twisted stroke of fate for the Bennett Foundation. I didn't ask for the assignment. It just landed on my desk one Monday morning with a note from my boss. You're meticulous. We need clean numbers on this one. The Bennett Foundation was supposedly a philanthropic project, my family's pet charity focused on community dining initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. The work was routine at first, spreadsheets, invoices, vendor summaries. But late one night in June, long after most of the office had gone home, I was cross-checking expense reports and saw a line item that didn't belong. A wire transfer from the foundation's account to a vendor listed as Howard Hospitality LLC. I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't in any of the approved supplier lists. I opened the file, heart picking up speed. The company address was a private suite in Hoboken. My fingers hesitated before I typed it into the business registry database. It loaded slowly as if the universe wanted to draw it out. Registered owners, Victoria Bennett and James Walker. I stared at the screen, pulse pounding in my ears. My sister and her husband. For a moment I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe they were consulting. Maybe it was legitimate. But when I pulled the past statements, I saw more. Transfers steady and deliberate every quarter for 2 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars labeled consulting fees. My hands trembled. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. They weren't content with being the golden ones. They were feeding on what wasn't theirs. I sat there for a long time, staring at the numbers glowing in the dark office. The hum of the fluorescent light above me sounded almost like breathing. It hit me then. They hadn't only cut me out of the family dinner. They'd been eating everyone else's portion too. The next morning I went straight to my boss, Greg Larson, a tall, balding man who hated confrontation almost as much as he loved golf. I told him about the discrepancy, careful not to accuse anyone outright. He listened, arms crossed, nodding slowly. And when I finished, he said quietly, "Clara, do yourself a favor. Don't dig any deeper. I'm just saying the numbers don't line up," he sighed. "Some clients are complicated. You don't want to get involved in this. Trust me." That should have been my cue to walk away. But something in his voice, resigned, practiced, told me he'd said that line before. That afternoon, while I was leaving the office, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text. "Focus on your job. Don't play hero." I froze in the middle of the sidewalk. The wind bit through my coat. The words looked like they were typed by someone who knew exactly what I'd seen. I didn't reply. I deleted the message, but I didn't forget it. For the next week, I tried to act normal. I filed reports, smiled when people passed my desk, laughed at things that weren't funny. But at night, I couldn't sleep. The guilt sat on my chest like a weight. I'd promised myself I'd never be part of their world again. But now that world was staring back at me through spreadsheets, Finally, one Friday night, I printed everything. Every transaction, every email, every signature that tied Howard Hospitality to the Bennett Foundation. I stored them in a plain manila folder, locked it in a box under my bed. The following Monday, Greg called me into his office again. I got a call from the Foundation's accounting team, he said, rubbing his temples. They asked if one of our staff members was reviewing their private financials without authorization. I didn't move. Clara, you didn't, did you? I reviewed the files assigned to me, I said evenly. He exhaled. Then stop there, please, for your own good. That night I sat on the edge of my bed with the folder in my lap. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of the city. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone years ago saying, "It's better if you stay home." About how easily they'd erased me, how sure they were that I'd never matter. I wasn't sure what mattered now, revenge, truth, or just the need to prove I'd seen something real. By midnight, I made a decision. I drove to a 24-hour copy center, scanned everything, and emailed it anonymously to the Financial Oversight Committee of the state. The email was simple: evidence of misuse of charitable funds, Bennett Foundation. Please review. When I hit send, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. I knew that once I did this, there was no going back. Weeks passed. No one said a word. Life returned to its dull rhythm. I almost convinced myself they'd ignored it. Until one August morning, I saw the headline flash on the news screen in the lobby: Bennett Foundation under investigation for financial irregularities. The article mentioned improper fund allocation shell corporations and unverified consulting expenses. No names yet. Just whispers. By noon, my phone rang. It was my mother. I didn't answer. Then Victoria called. I silenced that too. At 5, I went home and turned on the TV. There they were, my family, standing outside the courthouse dressed perfectly for damage control. Victoria, poised and rehearsed, told reporters it was all a clerical mistake. "We've always operated with integrity," she said. Dad nodded beside her face, firm jaw set. Evelyn looked small scared. A reporter asked if they suspected a whistleblower. Victoria smiled tightly. Probably an overzealous employee who misunderstood our books. I muted the sound. The apartment filled with the bluish light of the screen. For a while, I just sat there watching my sister's lips move without hearing her voice. I didn't feel proud. I didn't even feel angry. Just still. I whispered to the empty room. I don't need them to be punished. I just need the truth to exist somewhere. The anchor's voice faded behind the static of the TV. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark listening. It sounded like the city was washing itself clean. Spring of 20 arrived like a quiet apology after a long, bruising winter. The Bennett Foundation scandal had faded from the headlines, and with it, the last thread tying me to my family. I'd quit my job 2 weeks after the investigation closed. No goodbye party, no speech, just a box of papers, a plant, and the kind of relief that feels suspiciously like grief. Michael was the one who stopped me from disappearing completely. "You've got a good brain, Clara," he said, handing me a cup of coffee across his worn kitchen table. "Use it for something that belongs to you this time." 2 months later, we signed the lease on a tiny brick storefront in Brooklyn. The space smelled like sawdust and dusted flour, and the paint peeled at the corners. But when sunlight hit the windows, it looked almost warm. We spent every spare hour scrubbing floors, sanding tables, painting walls the color of burnt cream. When the sign finally went up, the 5th seat, Michael stood on the sidewalk, hands on hips, smiling like it was a second chance at life. "You know why I like that name?" he asked. "Because every table for 4 deserves one more place, for the person who didn't think they'd be invited." I smiled, trying to hide the lump in my throat. When we opened, there was no grand launch. Just a chalkboard menu, a few mismatched chairs, and a small line of curious neighbors. I cooked, served washed dishes, handled the register. Michael managed supplies, and sometimes played the host greeting people, like they'd been coming here for years. He used to say, "The trick isn't feeding people, it's making them feel like they've been seen." We weren't fancy, but word spread fast. By fall, the 5th seat was packed most weekends. Our customers weren't the rich Manhattan types. It was teachers, bus drivers, freelancers with laptops. The kind of people who looked like they were always 5 minutes away from running out of hope. On Thanksgiving that year, we decided to stay open. It felt right. Around 8 p.m. after the rush had settled, an old man in a tweed jacket sat alone at the counter, quietly eating soup. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Thank you for the 5th seat." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." He smiled, soft and tired. "Every table has 4. You made room for one more. That's rare." Then he stood, left a generous tip, and walked out into the cold. After he left, I turned off the lights and sat by the window watching the snow begin to fall. For the first time, the silence didn't ache. It felt like something was knitting itself back together, stitch by slow stitch. I didn't know if I was healing or just filling the void, but either way it felt like progress. Over the next year, the 5th seat became a small refuge. People brought books, laptops, dates, even their secrets. Michael would joke that we were running a halfway house for lost souls. When a food critic wrote that the restaurant felt like a hug, I cut the line out of the paper and pinned it above the cash register. One evening, a venture capitalist came in, ordered the tasting menu, and asked to speak with me. He wanted to scale the concept open 5 more locations. "You've got something here," he said. "Authenticity sells. Authenticity sells." The words tasted wrong. I shook my head. "I'm flattered, but we're fine as we are." He looked surprised. "Don't you want to make real money?" I smiled politely. "We already do. Just not the kind you can count." After he left, Michael laughed so hard he had to sit down. "That's my girl," he said, wiping his eyes. "Protect what makes it real. That's the hard part." The next spring, 2020, the air turned heavy. People stopped coming. The city started shutting down 1 block at a time. Then the news came. The virus, the cases, the fear. Within a month, we closed our doors. I remember locking the front door one night and seeing our reflection in the glass, me and Michael standing side by side in our aprons, both pretending this was temporary. He tried to stay optimistic, but the cough started not long after. At first we laughed about it, probably just dust from all that flour, he'd say. But when he stopped showing up, I knew. The hospital wouldn't let visitors in, so we talked on the phone. Some nights he'd sound strong, joking about nurses flirting with him. Other nights I'd barely hear his voice. One morning the call didn't come. They let me see him once near the end. He was thinner, smaller, the lines of his face softened by the machines around him. I held his hand through latex gloves, and he smiled faintly. "Don't quit, kid," he whispered. "Make it mean something." 2 days later, he was gone. I went back to the restaurant alone. The chairs were stacked. The air still smelled like roasted herbs and coffee grounds. I found a note taped to the inside of the walk-in cooler. His handwriting was shaky but clear. "Turn the pain into gratitude. That's how you win." I stood there holding the paper, feeling the hum of the refrigerator in the silence. I locked up, turned off the lights, and sat by the front window. Outside, Brooklyn was quiet. Streets empty, sirens echoing faintly in the distance. The reflection in the glass looked like a ghost version of me, someone I wasn't sure I knew anymore. For the first time, silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like the start of something waiting to be named. I leaned back in the chair, staring into the stillness of my darkened restaurant, and breathed in the faint scent of time and rain. By 2023, I'd learned that power didn't need to announce itself. It just had to exist. Quiet, steady, undeniable. At 32, I was the CEO of Skyline Dining Group, a chain of fine dining restaurants that had somehow become the kind of name whispered across Manhattan reservations lists. Skyline 63 was the crown jewel, perched atop Bryant Tower, 63 stories above the city walls of glass reflecting the skyline like an ocean of light. From my office, I could see all of Manhattan stretching into the distance, every success and betrayal I'd ever lived through, buried somewhere in that glittering maze below. My staff moved like a well-rehearsed symphony. I didn't need to raise my voice. A glance, a nod, a quiet word was enough. Years of being ignored had taught me precision. It was mid-November when Grace, my general manager, knocked on my glass door, her voice bright with excitement. "Clara, you'll want to see this one." I looked up from the contract I was reviewing. Grace was holding her tablet like it contained gold. "Big reservation," she said. "Private Thanksgiving dinner. Very VIP family press contacts attached. They requested one of the Skyline suites." I took the tablet from her, scanning the form. The name hit me like a chord struck too hard. Reservation under Victoria Walker. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I could hear the hum of the office, the faint murmur of the espresso machine outside. Then I looked up, keeping my voice even. Victoria Walker. I repeated, "Are you sure that's correct?" Grace nodded, unaware. "Yeah, apparently she's some kind of corporate lawyer. Her team said she wants the full premium package, suite 2 5 courses, curated wine pairing. Her husband's name is James. They'll be hosting family." "Family," I said quietly, handing the tablet back. Grace smiled. "Looks like a great PR opportunity, right? They even said they might invite a journalist or two. Should I confirm it?" I leaned back in my chair. "Yes," I said finally. "Confirm it." She tilted her head. "Do you want me to handle it personally?" "That's fine. Just make sure everything's perfect." When she left, the room felt colder. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city was glowing, Manhattan's skyline endless beneath the winter sky. It struck me as both absurd and inevitable that in a city with 8 million people, my sister had chosen my floor, my restaurant, my world. The universe had a sense of irony I couldn't compete with. Sometimes justice didn't arrive in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it came quietly disguised as a reservation request. I didn't tell anyone else. But that night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood in the dark office watching the lights ripple across the glass. The reflection staring back wasn't the girl they'd left behind. She was gone long ago. The next morning, my phone buzzed. Mark Ellis, my attorney and closest confidant, appeared in the doorway before I could even put the glass down. "Grace told me about the booking," he said without preamble. "Tell me you're not actually considering keeping it." "I already confirmed it." He blinked. "You're kidding." I shook my head. "They want to eat dinner. Let them. Clara." This could explode. "You really want your family's circus on the 63rd floor of your flagship?" I smiled faintly. "It's Thanksgiving. What's more American than family drama over dinner?" He groaned, rubbing his forehead. "You're playing with fire." "No," I said, turning back to the window. "I'm just setting the table." Later that afternoon, Grace came back to finalize details. She'd drafted the confirmation email for Victoria and copied the corporate contacts. "Just want your sign-off before I hit send," she said, handing me her laptop. I skimmed the email quickly, my mind half elsewhere. Then I froze. At the bottom, under the contact chain, was a CC list. And there it was, right next to the general manager's names, my own. Clara Bennett. My stomach tightened. Grace didn't realize what she'd done. If Victoria saw that name, it would take her 10 seconds to connect the dots. Before I could react, Mark, who'd been standing beside the door, saw the screen. "Grace," he said lightly, "you mind if I just check the formatting on that?" He reached for the laptop. She handed it over. Smiling. "Of course." He clicked something quickly deleted. The CC hit save and handed it back. "Looks perfect now," Grace nodded, oblivious. "Sending it now." She walked out, humming. When the door closed, Mark turned to me, exhaling. That was close. I poured him a drink from the decanter on my shelf. If fate wanted her to know, she would have. He raised an eyebrow. "You believe in fate now?" "Sometimes," I said, taking a sip. "Sometimes I think it believes in me." The days that followed moved fast. Every morning brought new bookings, staff briefings, menu tastings. Outwardly, nothing changed, but underneath there was a pulse of anticipation that I couldn't ignore. Grace came in often with updates, guest counts, special requests, table arrangements. "They've booked the whole suite for the evening," she said one morning. 15 guests. They're paying in advance. Oh, and they want the theme to be Modern Family Thanksgiving. Very high-profile crowd. I almost laughed at the phrase. Modern Family. They had no idea how accurate that was. The night before the dinner, I stayed late at Skyline 63. The city outside was painted in silver and blue. I walked through the dining hall, running my fingers along the tables, adjusting a wine glass, here a candle there. Everything gleamed. The restaurant smelled faintly of cedar and citrus, calm, immaculate ready. Mark stopped by on his way out. "You sure you want to be here tomorrow?" he asked. "I built this place," I said. "I'm not hiding from it." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one that means something big's about to happen, and you're not sure if you're ready for it." I smiled. Maybe that's what makes it worth it. When he left, I stood by the window one last time. The city below looked like 1,000 tiny memories flickering at once. I lifted the glass of wine in my hand, its surface catching the light from the skyline. Sometimes justice doesn't need planning. Sometimes it just walks right through your door with a reservation. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The world outside glowed indifferent and alive. In that moment, I realized how strange it was that all it took for balance to return was a dinner. One dinner 10 years overdue. I set the empty glass down and whispered to no one. Sometimes fairness doesn't need revenge. It just needs timing. Outside Manhattan pulsed like a living thing, and for the first time in years I felt perfectly still. The day before Thanksgiving, the city had that sharp metallic cold that seemed to slice through glass. By late afternoon, the restaurant was quiet. Staff had finished prep and gone home early. I stayed behind, double-checking the guest list for the dinner I still couldn't quite believe was real. The elevator bell chimed. I looked up, expecting Mark or Grace, but when the doors opened, it wasn't either of them. My mother stepped out. Evelyn Bennett looked smaller than I remembered, though she still carried herself like someone who'd practiced dignity her whole life. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her beige coat buttoned to the throat. She held a leather handbag in one hand and something else, something invisible, in the other hesitation. "Clara," she said softly, the word trembling like glass. "Mom." She hesitated near the threshold, scanning the marble floors, the chandeliers, the skyline, glittering through the panoramic windows. Her eyes filled with something, pride maybe, or regret. It was hard to tell which. "This place," she murmured. "It's beautiful." I stayed behind my desk pen, still in hand. "Thank you." She nodded, looking around again before meeting my eyes. I didn't come to argue. She said, "I just came to say, I'm sorry for that year, for what happened." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and it startled me. My mother never allowed her voice to crack. I set the pen down. 10 years, I said quietly. 10 years for that sentence. Her shoulders lifted, then dropped. It wasn't supposed to be that way. Your sister always had good reasons. I finished for her. I know. She took a step forward. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight." I smiled faintly. "You're assuming forgiveness is the goal." Her eyes widened, the faintest flicker of pain there. "I just don't want tomorrow to turn into a scene," she said, her tone steadying. "There will be press, business associates. Don't make it something people talk about." That made me laugh, quietly, bitterly. "Mom, it's been something people talk about since 2015. The only difference is now I'm the one with the microphone." She flinched slightly at that, and guilt flashed across her face. "I know we hurt you," she whispered. "I told myself it was temporary, that you'd understand someday. But I was wrong. About what I asked." "About you," she said. "You didn't need us to make you smaller to prove yourself." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was heavy, like something old and fragile finally showing its cracks. She tried to reach for my hand. Reflex made me step back. Not far, just enough. The space between us grew wider than the room. Her hand fell. She blinked rapidly, regaining composure. "Don't let tomorrow ruin what you've built," she said softly. "Don't let anger be the only thing that lasts." She turned to leave. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing faintly until she disappeared into the elevator. When the doors closed, I exhaled for the first time in minutes. On the chair she'd occupied was a scarf, a soft, cream-colored knit I recognized instantly. She'd made it years ago, back when she still baked pies from scratch and sent me Christmas cards. I picked it up, ran my fingers along the frayed edge. It still smelled faintly like her perfume, jasmine and something floral I couldn't name. The elevator chimed again. This time it was Mark. He took one look at me, then the scarf in my hand, and frowned. "She came here." I nodded. What did she want? An apology. A warning. "Maybe both." He nodded slowly, eyes scanning my face. "You okay?" "I will be," I said. "If she comes back looking for it, keep this for her." I handed him the scarf. "Maybe she'll need it more than I do." He hesitated, then took it. "You sure?" "Yeah." He gave me one of those long looks, the kind that meant he wanted to say more, but knew better. And then left quietly. A few minutes later, Grace knocked on my door to grab a clipboard she'd left behind. When she entered, she noticed something on the conference table. "Hey, did someone leave this?" She held up a small white envelope, thin and unmarked, the edges slightly bent. I frowned. Where was it? Under one of the chairs. Maybe a guest dropped it. Let me see. She handed it to me. No name, no return address. Just my initials written in my mother's tidy handwriting. I didn't open it. I slipped it into the pocket of my blazer and nodded. Thanks, Grace. She left humming softly to herself, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the room. When the restaurant finally emptied and the city outside began to glow, I walked to the balcony. The wind was cold and restless, tugging at my hair, smelling faintly of snow and the East River. Below me, the city moved like it always did. Fast, unstoppable, uncaring. Cars streamed down Fifth Avenue like veins of light. I thought of my mother's face, the way her voice trembled when she said sorry. Forgiveness doesn't start with words. It starts when the shaking stops, when you can think of them without that familiar ache. I slipped my hands into my pockets, feeling the envelope still there, light as breath. The skyline shimmered, and for once the view didn't feel like a victory. It just felt real. Tomorrow, they would come. Tomorrow, everything would meet in one place again. But tonight, the city was mine. Thanksgiving night arrived dressed in gold. Manhattan pulsed with light, every window a flicker of celebration. From the 63rd floor of Bryant Tower, the city looked like a living constellation, bright, proud, and entirely unaware of the history unfolding inside its glass crown. Skyline 63 glowed with warm, honey-colored light. The VIP suite, room 2, had been arranged exactly to Victoria's request: bronze linens, dried floral centerpieces, soft jazz humming beneath the chatter of guests. Staff moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of Pinot Noir and roasted chestnut soup. I stood in my office behind the tinted glass, wearing a black suit so sharp it almost felt like armor. On the wall, 12 security screens flickered quietly, each showing a different angle of the restaurant. My eyes stayed on one, room 2. They had arrived. Richard Bennett, my father, walked in first, still carrying himself like a man who believed the room tilted toward him. He adjusted his tie, whispered something to a business associate, and gave that familiar laugh. Loud, rehearsed, meant to fill space. Victoria followed, wrapped in emerald silk, every inch the public figure she'd always been. She leaned in to kiss my mother's cheek, then turned to address the guests, radiating charm. James trailed behind her, smiling his polished smile, shaking hands, nodding at the right moments. My mother looked smaller than she had yesterday. She wore the same beige coat, though I noticed she hadn't replaced the scarf she'd left in my office. Her eyes moved around the room, taking in the view. The chandeliers the skyline reflected in the glass walls. She didn't smile. 10 years ago, there hadn't been a seat for me at their table. Now they sat inside a room I'd built. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the bitterness settle. The screens showed every detail. Victoria's bright laughter, my father's proud nods, the glint of their silverware catching the light. I didn't feel angry anymore. Watching them, I felt something quieter, almost detached, like studying a play I'd once been cast in before the director changed the script. Victoria stood to make a toast. Her voice carried even through the muted feed. To family, she said, raising her glass. To hard work, resilience, and everything that got us here. I almost laughed. The irony was too perfect to ruin. In another window, Grace appeared, moving quickly across the floor toward the suite. She knocked, entered with a polite smile, then leaned toward Victoria. I turned the sound on, Miss Walker Grace said, keeping her tone professional. Is everything to your satisfaction? Victoria frowned slightly. The Pinot's a little heavy. I was expecting something drier. I'll let the owner know. Grace replied. Victoria tilted her head, feigning casual interest. Oh, the owner's here tonight? Yes, ma'am. Victoria smiled. Then maybe she can come by. I'd love to thank her personally. Grace nodded. Of course. When Grace left the suite, she called me through the internal line. They'd like to speak with you personally, Bennett, she said. Should I tell them you're occupied? I said after a pause. Tell them I'll be there shortly. Mark, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner of my office, reviewing next week's contracts, looked up. You're actually going? I am. He set down his pen. You don't owe them that satisfaction. This isn't about satisfaction, I said. Fairness needs witnesses. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then make it count. I stood smoothing the sleeves of my jacket. My reflection in the window looked like someone I used to know, still me, but forged, sharper, steadier. I adjusted my hair, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked toward the door. The hallway was long and gleaming polished marble, reflecting the overhead lights. My heels clicked in rhythm, steady, unhurried, each step echoing off the walls. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon sage and something electric, like anticipation. With every step, I felt the past tighten and loosen at once. I wasn't walking toward a confrontation. I was walking into my own equilibrium. When I reached the glass doors of room 2, I stopped for a heartbeat, breathing in the muffled laughter behind them. Then I opened the door. The room fell almost silent. Heads turned. Victoria's eyes widened first. Clara. I smiled faintly. Mrs. Walker. I said, my voice calm. You wanted to meet the owner. My father's mouth opened slightly. His confusion caught between disbelief and anger. James straightened in his chair, already calculating how to make it look like he wasn't surprised. My mother didn't move. Her eyes just closed for a fraction of a second, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. Victoria forced a laugh. You own this place, I do. I let the words hang there, simple, weightless, undeniable. She blinked, searching for the right reaction. That's unexpected. I've heard that before. There was a murmur among the guests. Someone whispered my last name. Another asked if we were related. My father's jaw tightened. Is this a joke, he said. Not at all, I replied. Please enjoy your evening. Everything's been arranged just as you requested. I turned slightly toward Grace, who'd been standing at the door, pale but professional. Make sure they have what they need, I said. Yes, Ms. Bennett. The silence stretched again, fragile as glass. Then Victoria spoke, her smile sharp as ever. Well, she said, raising her glass, small world, isn't it? Not that small, I said. She froze for just a beat, enough for me to see the flicker in her expression, the crack in her perfect composure. I took a slow step back toward the door. Have a pleasant dinner, I said softly. Before leaving, I caught my mother's gaze. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. The door closed behind me with a soft click. Out in the corridor, I exhaled the sound barely audible over the hum of the city outside. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply walked into a room, looked the past in the eye, and left it sitting at its own table. I walked back toward my office, the echo of my footsteps folding into the distant laughter from room 2. The night went on, and Manhattan glowed like nothing had changed, though everything had. The room froze the second I stepped inside. Light spilled through the glass walls, catching on every fork and wine glass, like 1,000 tiny mirrors. For a moment, even the jazz humming in the background seemed to hold its breath. Victoria was the first to move. She blinked once, twice, and then straightened in her chair, her voice a half laugh, half demand. Clara. What are you doing here? Grace, ever composed, stepped forward before I could answer. Ladies and gentlemen, she said smoothly. This is Ms. Bennett, the owner of Skyline 63. You could have heard a pin drop. Forks paused mid-air. One of the guests, a man I recognized as one of my father's business partners, coughed into his napkin. My mother's hands tightened around her wineglass. My father was the first to recover, though the smile he forced looked like it was painted on. This is quite the surprise, he said, voice measured. Is this some kind of joke? I smiled, polite calm. No, Dad. It's just a family dinner. Like every year. The words seemed to echo even over the soft hum of the ventilation. Victoria stood, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. You planned this, she said. You wanted to embarrass us. Embarrass you? I tilted my head slightly. You're the ones who reserved the room. I just happened to own the building. Her mouth tightened. You could have said something. I said, but where's the fun in that? A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably. My father's partner whispered something under his breath. James, ever the polite ghost beside my sister, tried to smooth things over. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, he said. I turned to him. You're right. The misunderstanding was assuming I wouldn't be here. The air in the room changed, sharper now, charged. I could feel eyes darting between us, waiting for one of us to flinch. Victoria crossed her arms. What do you want, Clara? To make us look small. To prove a point. I met her gaze. I want Mom to know I'm still here. And I want you to understand I don't need anyone's permission to have a seat at the table. For the first time, her expression faltered. Not anger, something closer to disbelief. Maybe deep down she'd really believed I'd never rise above the version of me she left behind. James reached for his wineglass and missed. It toppled, hitting the table with a sharp crack before shattering across the marble floor. Red spread like a wound through the white tablecloth. No one spoke. My father stood slowly, straightening his jacket. "Enough," he said. "If this is your way of revenge, congratulations. You've made your point. Now let's end it before it gets worse." "Worse?" I asked. "You mean before anyone else realizes what kind of people you really are, Clara?" My mother's voice cut through everything, soft but firm. "Please." I looked at her. "Please, what?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Victoria grabbed her clutch and turned to Grace. "We'll take the check. We're leaving." Grace hesitated, glancing at me. "Actually, Mrs. Walker," she said carefully, "your party's reservation is already paid in full. Would you like me to send confirmation of the ownership?" My father snapped. "Confirmation?" "Of what?" Grace froze. I nodded at her to go on. She reached into her folder and handed him a printed copy of the property certificate. The official Skyline Dining Group documentation, my name bold at the top. He stared at it, lips pressed into a hard line. His eyes flicked from the paper to me. "You really did it," he said almost to himself. "You actually built this." I didn't answer. He handed the paper back to Grace, his voice low. "Keep it. I don't need proof of what I've lost." Victoria exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "We don't have to sit here and be part of your little morality play." I gave her a small smile. "Then don't. But it's funny. You always loved being the center of attention." Her eyes narrowed. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I said quietly. "I think it makes me free from you." For a long moment, no one moved. Then James finally spoke, voice uncertain. "Maybe we should just—" But before he could finish, my father cut in. "Sit down." He turned to me. "You've made your statement. Now leave us to eat in peace." I shook my head. "No, Dad. You're sitting in my house. You can finish your meal, but don't pretend peace is on the menu." He stared at me, eyes cold, the kind of look meant to make people back down. I didn't. I'd seen that look my whole life. Finally, he dropped his gaze. The silence stretched again. Grace cleared her throat gently. Would anyone like another bottle of wine? No one answered. I turned toward the door. The air behind me thick with everything unsaid. At the threshold, I paused and looked back at them, at the people who had once defined me. Now just figures frozen under the warm glow of chandeliers. "I don't need to be above you," I said softly. "I just need to stand where I belong." Then I left. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the moment like a photograph. Out in the hallway, the muted jazz from the lounge drifted through the speakers, a slow, nostalgic tune that sounded almost merciful. As I walked back toward my office, the reflection of the skyline shimmered on the marble floors. The city outside kept moving, lights flickering like a heartbeat, indifferent to who won or lost. For the first time that night, I felt completely weightless. Not victorious, not vengeful, just steady, and somewhere behind me in the room. I'd built the family that once refused me a chair, finally sat in silence, staring at their reflections in the glass walls, wondering how long it would take for the world outside to stop watching. By morning, the city already knew. My phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from numbers I didn't recognize, messages from reporters, notifications piling up like debris. Someone had leaked the story overnight. The headlines spread fast. Prominent Bennett family dines at estranged daughter's restaurant. Without knowing she owns it. The article was everywhere. Phrases like poetic justice and family irony trended across social media. Photos of Skyline 63 lit up timelines, my name tagged alongside Victoria's in every post. I stared at the screen, watching the story multiply like wildfire until I turned the phone face down. By 9 a.m., Mark was in my office, holding a copy of the New York Ledger. "Well," he said, dropping it on the table, "you're famous." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do anything." "That's the problem," he said, pacing. "You don't have to. The internet's doing it for you." Grace walked in next, looking nervous. Victoria called. Or rather, her assistant did. "She's threatening legal action." "Of course she is," Mark muttered. I sighed, already expecting it. "What's the claim?" Grace hesitated. Violation of privacy, defamation. Emotional distress. I couldn't help but laugh, quiet and sharp. Emotional distress. She booked the table. Mark leaned against my desk. Expect papers by tomorrow. She's not the type to let a public bruise heal quietly. He was right. By the next day, an envelope arrived by courier, formal, heavy, embossed with the name Nora Mitchell and Associates. The same Nora Mitchell who'd built her career defending corporations with image problems. When Mark read through it, he whistled. They're suing Skyline 63 for defamation and misuse of image, he said. Apparently, the leaked footage from the dining room counts as intentional humiliation. There was footage, I asked. He frowned. Apparently, someone inside the staff leaked security video, probably after it hit social media. I sat back in my chair. Let her sue. He looked at me. You're serious? Yes. The next week, we met in a conference room on the 44th floor of Nora Mitchell's Midtown office. Glass steel views of the Hudson. Everything about the place screamed intimidation. Victoria sat across the table in a white power suit, her hair perfect, her face calm but taut. James sat beside her, expression unreadable. Nora Mitchell herself, early 50s, sharp-eyed, composed, smiled without warmth. Let's get to it, Nora said, sliding a file across the table. My client's reputation has been severely damaged. The leaked footage clearly shows private family members being subjected to public mockery. Mark opened his folder. The footage wasn't leaked by my client, nor was it authorized. And there was no mockery. The restaurant was operating as normal. Victoria's voice cut through, cool and clipped. You let it happen. You humiliated us. I looked at her evenly. You humiliated yourselves. I just happened to own the building. Her jaw tightened. Nora leaned forward. Ms. Bennett, you understand we'll be pursuing damages for the mental and emotional harm caused to the family. Mark didn't even look up. You understand that reputation isn't a legal right, correct? Nora blinked, surprised by his tone. Defamation requires falsehood. Mark continued. Nothing false was said or done. Everything that happened was factual, and on private property rented by your clients. The silence that followed stretched thin. Victoria finally spoke, her voice lower now. You think this makes you look noble? You think the public will side with you when they see what you did to your family? I smiled faintly. I think the public already has. Mark closed the folder. We're done here. We stood to leave. Nora's parting words followed us out the door. You're not as untouchable as you think, Ms. Bennett. Reputation has a long memory. The next morning, the long memory of the internet got shorter. A video surfaced online. Clear, well-framed footage from the dining room security camera. It showed the moment I walked into the room, Victoria's face freezing mid-smile, my father gripping the edge of the table, the wine glass shattering. Someone had uploaded it anonymously. Within hours, it spread everywhere. The caption beneath the clip read, "When karma books a reservation." The hashtag #FamilyFrozen took off within the day. Comment sections were flooded with speculation and opinion. Some called it justice. Others called it cruel. But for once, I didn't read them all. That afternoon, the New York Ledger reached out for an exclusive interview. I declined. A few smaller outlets offered op-eds, TV spots. I turned those down too. Mark called later that night. You know, silence might be the most powerful move you've made. Yet, he said, I looked out the window at the skyline, lights glittering like distant promises. The truth doesn't need help, I said. It just needs time. He chuckled. That's a very lawyer thing to say. You sure you're not in the wrong profession? Maybe I learned from the right people, I said. A week later, the court hearing was scheduled. Small, fast-tracked. The public wanted a show. I wanted closure. The courtroom was stark and cold, its walls too white, the kind of place where even breathing felt like a performance. Victoria sat with Nora at one table. Mark and I sat at the other. Cameras weren't allowed, but whispers filled the seats like static. Nora spoke first, smooth and precise, painting a picture of emotional sabotage and media manipulation. The defendant used a family's private moment as spectacle, she said. She allowed private footage to circulate, unchecked, weaponizing humiliation for attention. Mark waited for her to finish before standing. There's no evidence linking my client to any release of footage, he said. But since we're talking about integrity, perhaps we should address the history of how this family treats the concept. He walked to the bench and handed over a folder. Documentation of financial mismanagement within the Bennett Foundation. Transactions authorized by Victoria Bennett and James Walker under the shell company, Howard Hospitality. These records were obtained legally years ago. The judge scanned the paper's expression unreadable. The air in the room thickened. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time. "That's irrelevant," she hissed. Mark smiled faintly. "It speaks to credibility." The rest of the hearing moved quickly. Nora objected. The judge overruled. Her arguments deflated like a balloon losing air. By the end of the day, the ruling came case dismissed. No damages, no defamation, no victory for them this time. As we stepped outside the courthouse, the cold hit sharp and clean. Reporters swarmed nearby shouting questions. Mark shielded me as we moved through the crowd. "How does it feel, Ms. Bennett?" one of them called out. "To win, against your family." I didn't stop walking. "It wasn't a win," I said. "It was proof." That night, back in my office at Skyline, I set the judgment paper on my desk. Simple black text on white paper. No celebration, no spotlight. Justice doesn't need applause. It's the quiet line on a page that means you can finally look the world in the eye again. Outside, the city kept glowing. Indifferent, relentless, and for the first time, entirely fair. A week after the court ruling, the Bennetts had become a headline, instead of a family. Every major paper ran some version of the same story: Bennett legacy in crisis. The fallout was fast and merciless. My father's investment firm lost its biggest client within 48 hours. Partners withdrew, stockholders called for his resignation. By the weekend, the firm announced a temporary suspension of operations pending review. Victoria's name was plastered across legal blogs. The state bar launched an ethics investigation, citing the resurfaced financial misconduct tied to the old charity scandal. Her firm issued a statement that she would be taking an indefinite leave. And just like that, the family that had built its identity on prestige and perception was watching both evaporate in real time. I didn't feel triumphant. Sitting in my office at Skyline, scrolling through the news, all I felt was a kind of stillness. Justice had arrived, but quietly, without applause. Outside my window, the city kept moving. Taxis, office lights, people chasing their next victory. I closed my laptop, leaned back, and let the silence stretch. When the knock came, I assumed it was Mark. But it wasn't. It was Helen Reed, the journalist who'd been covering the story since the night of the dinner. She wore a dark trench coat and carried a small recorder in her hand. 5 minutes, she said. "Off the record." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Go ahead." She didn't waste time. "Do you consider what happened?" "Revenge?" I looked at her, then at the skyline beyond her shoulder. "No," I said. "It's correction. I just drew the line where it should have been years ago." Helen studied me for a moment, eyes searching for something. "Some people would call that poetic." "Maybe," I said, "but poetry is usually about pain before it's about beauty." She turned off her recorder, nodded once, and stood. "You know," she said softly, "people will write about you for years. Not as the villain, not as the victim either. Something in between. I can live with that." When she left, the office felt even quieter. I sat there for a while, tracing the rim of my coffee cup with my finger until the sun slipped behind the skyline and the lights of the city took over. Across the river, in the house I grew up in, I imagined another kind of silence. My father alone in his study, the fireplace unlit, his phone buzzing endlessly until he finally turned it face down, the sound of glass clinking, the quiet thud of disappointment settling in. Victoria packing boxes in her office, the awards from her career gifts lined up like ghosts. She'd built a life on control, but now every reflection reminded her of the moment she'd lost it. James pacing, the kitchen phone in hand, whispering into the receiver. Some last attempt to salvage their reputation. And my mother, Evelyn, sitting in the dining room, staring at the family portrait that used to hang above the mantel. The table was set for 4, but only one chair was occupied. That's how I pictured them, each in their own silence, finally facing what they'd built. Later that night, I was the last one left in the restaurant. The cleaning crew had gone home, and the only light came from the hallway sconces reflecting off the marble floors. I walked down to the lobby to lock up, and that's when I saw her. My mother standing near the reception desk. She was dressed simply a wool coat, her hair pinned back. She didn't speak, just gave a faint nod to the host and placed an envelope on the counter. Then she turned and walked out before I could even cross the room. I called after her once, but the elevator had already closed. The receptionist handed me the envelope. My name was written across it in her familiar handwriting. I carried it upstairs, sat at my desk, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. Clara, it read. You've proven more than I ever let myself believe you could. I won't ask you to forget, only to live without needing approval from anyone. Not even me. Love, Mom. I read it twice. Then again, the handwriting trembled in places like she'd written it quickly. Maybe crying, maybe afraid she'd lose her nerve. I placed the letter down, opened the drawer on my right, and took out the cream-colored scarf she'd left behind. It was soft and worn, still carrying that faint scent of her perfume. I laid the letter on top of it and closed the drawer slowly. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it's just the moment the wound stops bleeding. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes as the hum of the city drifted up from the streets below. Outside, traffic moved like a current of light. Somewhere in the dark stretch of New Jersey sky, I imagined my mother looking out her window, maybe thinking of me the same way. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance, such vast, clean, and necessary. The scarf, the letter, the silence, they weren't symbols of loss anymore. They were markers of where the pain had ended. When I finally stood to leave, the city glowed against the glass, indifferent and eternal. For the first time, I understood what Michael had meant years ago, when he said pain could become gratitude. Not gratitude for what they'd done, but for what it had forced me to become. By December, the city had traded its steel edges for soft lights and garlands. Manhattan sparkled under early Christmas decorations, and Skyline 63 felt warmer than it ever had. The glass walls reflected a glow of gold and green, and laughter from the dining room floated through the air like something fragile but real. We weren't hosting a gala that night. No press, no suits, no shareholders, just my staff, my team, gathered around a long wooden table we'd pushed together. Grace had insisted on cooking. Mark brought a pie that looked store-bought but tasted better than anything prepackaged should. We ate roast chicken instead of turkey, and for the first time in a long time, the word family didn't sting when I heard it. Mark raised his glass, the rim catching the light. To the family we choose, he said. Everyone clinked glasses, cheering softly. I smiled, the sound wrapping around me like something I didn't know I'd missed. After dinner, I slipped away to the balcony while they lingered over dessert. The air outside was crisp sharp with the scent of winter. From 63 stories up the streets looked like rivers of color. Taxi lights flowing with holiday reds and greens, people wrapped in coats, arms full of shopping bags chasing warmth and purpose. I rested my hands on the railing and let the cold bite at my fingers. Somewhere below, carolers were singing faintly. Their voices carried upward in snatches. For once, I didn't feel like I was watching from the outside. Movement caught my eye. On the sidewalk far below, a woman stepped out of a yellow cab. She looked up at the tower, shielding her eyes from the wind. Even from that distance, I knew the tilt of her head, the way she held her purse close to her chest. Mom! Evelyn stood still for a moment, gazing up at the building. Then she turned, blending into the current of people and disappearing around the corner. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just watched until she was gone. Sometimes love means letting someone walk away without trying to stop them. Behind me, the door to the balcony opened. Mark stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. You hiding again? He asked, just catching my breath. He handed me a cup. You know, some of the guys are trying to get you to tell a story. They think you were a lawyer in a past life. I laughed softly. Close enough. He leaned against the railing beside me. You ever think about going home for the holidays? I took a sip of coffee, the steam clouding in the air. I did once, I said, but I think I already have one. He nodded, smiling in that quiet way that didn't need words. Fair enough. We stood there a moment, looking out over the city. From inside, the sound of laughter drifted through the glass. Grace scolding one of the waiters for spilling whipped cream, someone playing Sinatra off-key on the piano. When we went back in, the TV above the bar was playing the late-night news. The sound was low, but a familiar voice made me look up. Victoria. She was sitting across from an interviewer in a studio, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her tone was calm, deliberate, the smile almost human. I've learned, she said, that reputation can't replace honesty, and that sometimes losing everything is how you learn what matters. The interviewer nodded, and the camera lingered on her face before fading to a commercial. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction, just a quiet kind of understanding. Maybe she'd meant it, maybe she hadn't. Either way, it wasn't mine to fix anymore. Mark noticed me watching and said gently, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. She finally said something true. He smiled faintly, then lifted his cup toward the staff across the room. "They're talking about opening a bottle of champagne. You want in?" I shook my head. "I'm good. Go ahead." He left, and I wandered over to the bar. The lights were dimmed now, reflecting off the glass bottles like tiny constellations. One of the newer staff members, a quiet girl named Mia, was cleaning glasses. She looked up shyly. "You did good tonight, boss. Everyone's happy." "Thank you," I said. "That's all I wanted." She smiled and went back to polishing, humming softly. I leaned against the counter, watching my reflection blur in the mirror behind the bar, the skyline glowing faintly behind me, the restaurant alive with the people I'd built my second life with. There are victories that roar, and there are victories that whisper. This one barely made a sound. Outside, snow began to fall over the city, soft and slow, like forgiveness finally arriving on its own time. No triumph would ever be louder than this silence. It was long past midnight when the restaurant finally went quiet. The last of the staff had gone home, leaving behind the soft hum of the heaters and the faint scent of roasted herbs still lingering in the air. I walked through the empty dining room heels, echoing softly against the polished floor. Every table was cleared, every glass stacked neatly, yet the air still felt full. Of laughter, of conversations, of something that had finally settled inside me. The candles had burned low, leaving little pools of wax that glowed faintly in the golden light. I trailed my hand across the linen tablecloths as I moved, each touch stirring the ghost of the night's warmth. The chairs stood pushed in, waiting quietly for the next story to unfold. At the end of the hallway, I stopped in front of the glass door to the VIP room 2, the same room where weeks ago everything had come undone and come full circle. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a soft amber. I pushed the door open, and the room welcomed me like an echo. The long table stood empty now, the centerpiece removed, but I could still see it. The way they'd sat, the way my father's jaw clenched, the way my sister's smile faltered when she realized who I was. I walked closer. Stopping at the head of the table, a faint mark still stained the marble, where James had spilled his wine that night. I brushed my fingers across it, dry now, almost invisible, but still there, like a memory that refuses to vanish completely. 10 years, one full circle. I used to pray they would see me. Now, all I prayed was that I would see myself. Outside the window, the city stretched endlessly, its lights shimmering like constellations scattered across the earth. New York never slept, and in that moment, neither did I. I turned off the chandelier, letting the room fall into half-darkness. The soft reflection of the skyline glowed on the glass walls, painting me into the scene I had once been excluded from. Only now it belonged to me. I stepped out onto the balcony, the cold air biting at my skin. The city breathed below. Cars moving like tiny sparks, the wind whispering between the towers. I took a deep breath, the kind that filled every empty space left behind. The scarf my mother had left years ago was draped around my shoulders. The wind caught it gently, wrapping it around my arm like a ghost's embrace. I looked down at it, then out at the skyline, and for the first time it didn't feel heavy. It just felt like part of me. Inside the restaurant, lights flickered once as the building's power cycled for the night. I poured myself a final glass of wine and leaned against the railing. "Happy Thanksgiving," I whispered to no one in particular. The words drifted into the night, carried away by the wind that smelled faintly of snow. Justice was never about making anyone bow their heads. It was about lifting my own, finally, without the weight of what they'd done to me. The past had lost its grip. The silence no longer sounded like absence. It sounded like peace. Behind me, the restaurant stood dark, waiting for morning. The skyline stretched endlessly ahead, and I could see my reflection in the glass, calm, steady, unafraid. The woman in that reflection wasn't the girl who'd been left out of her family's dinner table. She was the one who built her own. I raised my glass again, just enough for the light to catch it. "Here's to new tables," I said softly, "and to everyone who ever learned to build one. If you've ever been left out of someone else's table, remember, nothing stops you from building your own. Tell me your story. I'm listening."